He survived countless battles, defeated the greatest empire on earth, and then something invisible brought him down. Babylon, 323 BCE. The most powerful man in the world lay dying, not on the battlefield, but in his bed. No wounds, no enemy, no escape, just a fever that refused to break. For 12 days, Alexander the Great faded, and when he died, he left behind a mystery that historians still cannot explain. So what really killed the man who conquered the world? Babylon was the crown jewel of the ancient world, a city of 1,000,000 souls, a city of hanging gardens and towering ziggurats, a city that smelled of incense and river water and ambition. And on the night of May 29th, 323 BCE, it was lit by torchlight and loud with the sound of men who believed they were invincible. Alexander was 32 years old. He had never lost a battle, not once, not one single time in 13 years of continuous war. He had crossed deserts that should have killed him. He had crossed mountains that should have buried his army alive. He had faced the Persian Empire, the mightiest military force the ancient world had ever assembled, and he had broken it apart like kindling. He had marched to the edge of India, where his soldiers finally refused to go further, not because they were beaten, but because they were exhausted. He had come home to Babylon as a god. At least, that is what he believed himself to be. That night, Alexander attended an elaborate banquet in honor of Nearchus, the admiral of his fleet. The wine flowed freely. It always did. This was not unusual. Alexander had always drunk heavily. It was Macedonian culture. It was warrior culture. It was what men did when they were celebrating survival. But then, something shifted. After the banquet for Nearchus, a man named Medius appeared. Medius of Larissa, a companion, a cavalry officer, a close friend. One of those men who, as Plutarch would later write, was a leader and skilled master of the choir of flatterers, who danced attendance on Alexander. Medius invited the king to a second, more intimate gathering, a smaller party, perhaps 20 men. Alexander went. He drank unmixed wine, undiluted, pure, the kind of drinking that the Greeks reserved for desperate courage or dangerous excess. At one point, according to the accounts that have survived, Ephippus tells us that Alexander called for a 6-quart cup, the cup of Heracles, a vessel so enormous that historians have struggled to imagine it. He raised it. He drank. And then, according to the account of Diodorus Siculus, who drew on eyewitness sources, Alexander let out a sudden shriek, as if smitten by a violent blow. His companions rushed to him. They led him by the hand back to his apartments. Was it the wine? Was it something in the wine, or was something already growing inside him that the wine had only just awakened? Nobody asked that question that night. They put the king to bed and kept watch over him. The physicians were called. No one offered any diagnosis. Court physicians who failed a king did not live comfortably. The safest answer was silence. But Alexander was already burning. The next morning, May 30th, Alexander bathed. He rested through the heat of the day. That evening, he dined again with Medius and drank heavily for a second night. He believed he could sweat it out. He believed, as men who have never lost believe, that his body would simply overcome whatever this was. He was wrong. By the 31st of May, he could no longer walk to the sacrificial altar under his own strength. He was placed on a litter and carried. His officers gathered around him in the cool of the morning, waiting for orders. And Alexander gave them. His voice was weaker, but the orders came. The Arabian campaign would proceed as planned. The fleet would launch. The infantry would march. He was not going to let a fever interrupt the conquest of the world. The royal diaries, the official daily record kept by the court, document these days with a clinical precision that feels almost unbearable to read now, knowing what we know. On May 31st, transported by litter to sacrifice. On June 1st, carried across the Euphrates on his couch to the gardens on the east bank, where the air was cooler and the shade was deeper. At first, his body responded. The fever dipped. He played dice with Medius. He met with his officers. He spoke of Arabia. But it was a false recovery, the kind the body offers before it surrenders. Think about this for a moment. This is a man who had taken an arrow through the lung in the assault on the Malian citadel 2 years before. His lung had collapsed. His blood had sprayed the faces of the men trying to extract the arrowhead. And he had recovered. He had walked out of that tent on his own feet, and his soldiers had wept at the sight of him. This is a man who had been knocked unconscious by a stone thrown from the walls of a besieged city in Syropolis, who had fought at the front of every major engagement, not from behind his generals, but ahead of them on horseback with a spear. And now a fever was pulling him apart, day by day, hour by hour. By June 3rd, the fever was rising again. His body, which had endured 13 years of war, was losing this battle. The doctors watched. They said nothing. The generals began to whisper. But here is what nobody in that palace fully understood yet. Long before Alexander arrived in Babylon, the city had been signaling its intentions. The omens had been accumulating for weeks, like thunderclouds on a horizon. When Alexander approached Babylon in the spring of 323, a delegation of Chaldean priests had intercepted him on the road. These were the ancestral astronomers of Babylon, men who had tracked the stars and the fates of kings for centuries. Their message was direct. Do not enter the city. Something terrible awaited him there. Death awaited him there. Alexander dismissed them. His philosopher Anaxarchus reminded him that he was above the superstitions of ordinary men. Alexander quoted Euripides and rode on. But Plutarch tells us something chilling. When Alexander reached the outskirts of Babylon, he saw ravens in the sky above the city. They were fighting each other, clawing at each other in midair, and several of them fell dead at his feet. The ancient world did not have the vocabulary of virology or bacteriology. What it had was pattern recognition, sharpened by centuries of observing nature. Dead birds fallen around a man who would soon be dying of fever in a city surrounded by swamps and canals and standing water. Modern historians writing in the New England Journal of Medicine and in publications of the Centers for Disease Control have pointed to those dead ravens as significant, not as omens, as evidence. Dead birds falling in unexplained numbers in the Middle East around a body of water. That is the signature of West Nile virus. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The fever was rising. The man was still giving orders, and the army outside the palace walls had no idea their king was coming apart. By June 4th, the false recovery was over. The fever came back with a violence that left no room for denial. Alexander was carried back across the Euphrates to the palace, not to the gardens, not for fresh air, to the palace where the physicians could watch him, where the generals could reach him, where the machinery of empire could still pretend to function around the failing body of the man who had built it. he continued to brief his officers. He was not ready to stop. He ordered the fleet to prepare. He gave instructions about unit formations, about supply routes, about the upcoming march into Arabia. His voice was fading, but his mind was still sharp enough to be terrifying. A man who had spent his entire adult life in motion, who had not been still for more than a few weeks at a stretch since he was 20 years old, could not simply lie down and be quiet. But his body was making that decision for him. By June 5th, he could no longer sit upright without assistance. The fever was constant now, not spiking and retreating, but a steady, consuming heat that was burning through him from the inside. He was bathing frequently in cold water to bring it down. It helped for an hour, maybe 2. Then the fire returned. Aristobulus, one of the eyewitnesses whose account survives through later historians, stated explicitly that Alexander was seized with a raging fever, that when he became very thirsty, he drank wine which made him delirious, and that he died. That phrase, drank wine which made him delirious, is not a moral judgment. It is a medical observation. He was so parched, so absolutely consumed by the thirst that high fever produces, that when water was available, he still demanded wine, chilled wine. He could not stop himself. In Greek medical practice at the time, wine was prohibited to fever patients. Everyone at court knew this. The physicians hovering around his bed knew this, and not one of them said a word, because the last doctor who had crossed Alexander over a medical matter had been flogged, because Alexander had recently executed the physician who failed to save Hephaestion, his closest friend, who had also drunk himself through an illness he might have survived with rest and water. So the king drank wine, and the fever climbed. By June 6th, Diodorus tells us, Alexander had become so weak that he turned his signet ring over to Perdiccas, his ring, the seal of the Macedonian Empire, the object that authorized every document, every order, every transaction in the known world. He handed it to Perdiccas because he could no longer conduct necessary business himself. He was still alive, he was still conscious, but he was handing over the instruments of power the way a man hands things to someone else when he knows he will not be able to carry them much further. The generals knew now. There was no longer any question about what was happening. By June 7th, Alexander could not speak. The voice that had commanded 50,000 soldiers across 3 continents, that had roused men to charge into the greatest armies the ancient world had assembled, that had negotiated with kings and philosophers and gods, was gone, silenced, not by a blade, not by an arrow, by something so small that no one in the ancient world could have seen it. He lay in the palace in Babylon, mute, burning, his chest rising and falling with an effort that must have been visible to everyone in the room. And outside, the rumors had started. The army was enormous. Tens of thousands of soldiers camped outside the city. These were men who had followed Alexander from Macedonia to Egypt to Persia, to the Hindu Kush, to the banks of the Indus River and back. They had watched him bleed. They had carried him off battlefields. They had seen him take wounds that should have been fatal and walk away. They did not believe their king was dying. They believed, as soldiers do when they have followed a man for a decade of impossible victories, that he was simply unbreakable. What they did believe was that someone was hiding something from them. The rumor tore through the camp like a fire through dry grass. Alexander was already dead, and the generals were concealing it to consolidate power before announcing it. The soldiers' response was immediate and overwhelming. They gathered at the palace gates. They demanded to see him. Not a statement from his generals, not a letter with his seal on it. Him, alive, in person. The generals had no choice. The doors of the palace were opened and the soldiers filed in. Picture this: an enormous stone palace in the middle of Babylon. June heat pressing down on everything. The smell of the river. The smell of incense burning somewhere in the corridors. The sound of thousands of sandaled feet moving slowly through a building that had been built by the kings of Babylon, that had housed Nebuchadnezzar, that had seen empires rise and collapse and rise again. And in one of its rooms, on a couch, lay the man who had conquered more of the world than any human being before or since. The soldiers came in one by one, thousands of them, Macedonians, Persians, Greeks, men from the edges of the known world who had marched under his banner. They filed past him in silence. Alexander could not speak. He could not rise, but he could see them. The royal diaries record this moment with devastating simplicity. He greeted each of them with his right hand, raising his head with difficulty and making a sign with his eyes. Read that again. He raised his head with difficulty. This is the man who had charged the Persian lines at Gaugamela, who had been the first up the siege ladder at the Malian citadel, standing alone on top of a wall surrounded by enemies, fighting until his men could reach him, who had wrestled a wounded lion to the ground in a hunting incident that shocked even his most hardened companions. Now he was raising his head with difficulty, and still he looked at every single soldier who passed him. He saw them, he acknowledged them with his eyes, because his voice was gone and his body had surrendered everything except the last fragments of will. The man who commanded armies could no longer command his own body, but he could still see his men, and he made sure they knew it. Some of those soldiers wept. Arrian records this: battle-hardened men, men who had watched friends die in a dozen different countries, men who had never flinched at carnage, were weeping as they filed past their king, because they understood, perhaps before Alexander himself fully accepted it, that this was a farewell. That night, June 9th, 5 of his senior officers and 2 Greek seers went to the temple of Serapis and slept there, seeking divine guidance. They asked whether Alexander should be brought to the temple, whether the god of the underworld and the healing arts might intervene on his behalf. The answer came back: leave him where he is. On the evening of June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander III of Macedon died. He was 32 years old. 1 month short of his 33rd birthday, he had reigned for 13 years. He had never lost a battle. He died not from a wound, not from an assassin's blade, not from the kind of violent, glorious death that the literature he loved, the Iliad, the poetry of Achilles, had taught him to expect and perhaps to desire. He died in a bed, in a city, of something that moved through his blood invisibly and without mercy. The greatest conqueror in human history was taken not by an army, but by the air itself. And now the question that has haunted historians, physicians, and forensic scientists for over 2,000 years. What killed him? The accounts agree on the symptoms: high fever, raging, unrelenting thirst, delirium, progressive loss of motor function, loss of speech, a 12-day decline from apparent health to death, no wounds, no visible injury. What they do not agree on is the cause. The first theory, the one that circulated almost immediately, was poison. And this theory has a suspect. a very specific suspect. Cassander, the eldest son of Antipater, had arrived in Babylon only months before Alexander's death. Antipater was Alexander's regent in Macedonia, the man who had governed the homeland while Alexander conquered the world, and Alexander had been furious with Antipater. There were letters, there were accusations of tyranny, there was talk that Alexander intended to remove him from power. Antipater knew this. Cassander knew this. According to the most common version of the poisoning story, preserved in Plutarch, Cassander transported the poison to Babylon, concealed in a mule's hoof, and his brother Iolaus, who served as Alexander's royal cupbearer, mixed it into the king's wine on the night of Medius's party. Iolaus, the man who poured the wine. 5 years after Alexander's death, when the story first circulated widely, Alexander's mother Olympias was so convinced of this version that she had the grave of Iolaus exhumed and his ashes scattered to the winds, the most savage possible desecration in the ancient world. But here is the problem with the poison theory. Poison victims in the ancient world or the modern one do not typically take 12 days to die. If someone put a lethal dose of something into Alexander's wine on the night of May 29th, and the goal was to kill the king, why was he still alive on June 10th? That is not how assassination by poison works. That is not how any efficient murder works. The ancient poisons available to a Macedonian court in 323 BCE, substances like aconite, hellebore, or various plant-based toxins, either killed quickly or not reliably at all. A 12-day death by poison would require either extraordinary incompetence or a substance so subtle and slow-acting that it strains the available evidence. Most serious historians discount the poison theory, not because they are certain it did not happen, but because the timeline does not fit. So if not poison, then what? The second theory is typhoid fever, complicated by acute alcoholism. In 1998, Dr. David Oldak of the University of Maryland School of Medicine published an analysis in the New England Journal of Medicine, examining Alexander's symptoms against the known clinical progression of typhoid. The match is striking. High fever, abdominal pain, progressive neurological deterioration, loss of speech. In the late stages, the swamps around Babylon would have been a breeding ground for Salmonella typhi, the bacterium responsible. Alexander had been sailing through those swamps on his reconnaissance of the Euphrates tributaries in the weeks before his death. The heavy, sustained alcohol consumption would have done what alcohol always does to an immune system fighting a bacterial infection: destroyed it, not as the cause of death, as the accelerant. The third theory is the one that carries a peculiar resonance, given what happened before Alexander entered the city. Those ravens, falling dead from the sky at his feet. In 2003, researchers John Marr and Charles Kalischer published an analysis in Emerging Infectious Diseases, the Journal of the Centers for Disease Control, proposing West Nile virus as the cause of Alexander's death. Their argument rests on a straightforward observation. Unexplained die-offs of birds, particularly ravens and corvids, are a known indicator of West Nile virus circulating in a region. The virus amplifies in mosquitoes and birds several months before it spills over into human populations. The swamps and waterways around Babylon in June would have been exactly the kind of environment where Culex mosquitoes, the primary vector of West Nile, would have thrived. West Nile virus produces a febrile illness in most patients. In a small percentage, It penetrates the blood-brain barrier and attacks the neurological system. The loss of motor function, the loss of speech, the progressive paralysis of the final days, these are consistent with severe West Nile encephalitis. Marr and Kalischer wrote, "The oracles would have been correct. The dead birds at Alexander's feet were not a supernatural warning. They were an epidemiological one. The same agent that was killing the ravens was already in the mosquitoes that had bitten the king." There is a fourth theory, proposed by some scholars: leukemia, a rapidly progressing blood cancer that could explain the fever, the weakness, and the speed of deterioration. The evidence for this is thinner than for the other candidates, but it cannot be entirely dismissed. And then there is the theory that is not a theory at all, but simply an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what we know. Ernst Badian, one of the most rigorous Alexander scholars of the 20th century, wrote simply, "He certainly died of disease, undiagnosable to us. Immoderate feasting, sustained heavy drinking, a body that had been taking punishment for 13 years of continuous campaigning, and then some pathogen carried by a flea or mosquito or contaminated water, or simply the accumulated weight of everything he had put himself through that the body could not fight. Undiagnosable. That word carries its own particular weight, because what it means is this: the man who conquered the known world, who bent the arc of history with his will and his brilliance and his absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible, died of something we still cannot name with certainty, after 2,300 years of trying. When Alexander died, the men around his bed asked him to whom he left his kingdom. According to Diodorus, his answer was, "To the strongest." Though some historians have noted that the Greek phrase toi kratistoi, to the strongest, sounds very similar to toi krateroi, to Craterus, the name of one of his senior generals. Perhaps he named a successor. Perhaps he did not. Perhaps he was already too far gone to be understood. The ambiguity is itself a kind of tragedy. Within hours of his death, the palace was in chaos. His first wife, Roxana, was pregnant. She would give birth to a son 2 months later. His generals, the men who had marched with him, who had bled beside him, who had watched him perform acts of courage so extreme they had crossed into something like divinity, began immediately positioning themselves for power. The wars of the successors would tear his empire apart over the following decades. Cassander, the man suspected by some of having poisoned Alexander, would go on to kill Alexander's mother Olympias in 316 BCE. He would kill Roxana and her son, Alexander IV, in approximately 309 BCE. The bloodline of the conqueror was extinguished. Alexander's body was placed in a multi-layered gold sarcophagus and eventually taken to Egypt by Ptolemy, another of his generals, who understood that proximity to Alexander, even in death, was a form of political power. The sarcophagus arrived in Alexandria, where it remained on public display for centuries. Julius Caesar visited it. Augustus Caesar visited it. Caligula reportedly took Alexander's breastplate from the tomb and wore it. The location of that tomb today is unknown. It is one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. The greatest conqueror in history lies somewhere beneath a modern city, in a sarcophagus of gold, and no one knows where. In the end, Alexander, who had burned through the world like a fever himself, was taken by a fever. The man who had crossed deserts and mountains and oceans of blood, who had built an empire that stretched from Greece to India, who had genuinely believed himself to be the son of a god, was brought down by something too small to see, something that moved through the warm night air of Babylon, something that found him in the swamps along the Euphrates, something that had no interest whatsoever in his victories or his ambitions or his divinity. It found him, it entered him, and it did not stop. For 12 days it burned him alive from the inside, and on the evening of June 10th, 323 BCE, with his generals weeping and his soldiers already beginning to argue over what came next, Alexander the Great was gone. He conquered the world, but in the end, he could not conquer death. The mystery remains. The fever has never been explained, and somewhere in the ruins of Babylon, in the silt of the Euphrates, in the warm, still air above a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt a dozen times since the night he died there, the answer is still waiting. We just have not found it yet.